8 Coronation Street, spoilers for next week 27th to the 31st of January. Next week on Coronation Street, David makes a risky plan as Shona is kidnapped. Leanne is publicly humiliated, Amy faces a ghost from the past, and Abby makes a huge mistake. Please note that Corrie will only air on Monday and Wednesday this week. 1. Shona is kidnapped. The threats against the Platt family are taken to the next level next week, as Shona finds herself abducted. Shona and David have been living in fear of Harvey and his cronies, since David helped himself to the money that Harvey's half-brother Damon had offered to pay for Bethany's medical costs. Sarah had turned down the offer, which was just as well since it apparently wasn't Damon's money to give. But David couldn't resist swiping it for himself, using it to buy the house from Gail. It didn't take long for Harvey to discover who had taken it, and tasked Logan and Maddie Radcliffe with retrieving it. Although Maddie is now incarcerated, after the pair killed their younger brother Mason, Logan is still on the prowl as Harvey waits for his cash, with added interest. It feels the threats are ramping up. Jack P. Shepard explains, they're not just meeting David in dark alleys anymore, they're physically hurting members of his family. When it becomes general conversation on the street that Mason was killed by one of his brothers, who are the two that are after David, he really starts to panic. Next week, only a few days after David the dog was injured in a hit and run on the street, which the family took as a deliberate threat, Shona leaves the house unaware that a van is trailing her. It's not long before we see the van drive off at speed, with Shona's mobile phone lying discarded on the cobbles. In the back of the van, Shona desperately shouts out for help as she bashes on the door, but it's to no avail. When David later calls in to see Shona at the cafe, he's deeply concerned when he learns that she never turned up for her shift. Knowing they could come after his whole family, he's panicked and is desperate. Jack continues, he's trying to think of ways to pay the money back, but it's a huge lump sum to come up with and is bricking it. Realizing he's out of options, David reluctantly goes to the police station to talk to Kit, telling him that both his dog and his wife have been targeted in the past few days and he suspects Harvey is behind it. He comes clean to Kit over stealing the money and asks him to go have a word with Harvey about the threats. But of course Harvey denies having anything to do with it. Jack tells us David doesn't really trust Kit. He doesn't particularly like him after he went after his wife, but he's out of options. 2. David calls on an old friend. David later decides that it would be safer to separate himself from his family by finding somewhere else to stay, knowing that it's him that Harvey is really after. Calling on brother Nick, David admits to him that unless he can come up with the money fast, his entire family is in danger. David comes to realize that the only way he is going to be able to raise that sort of money is to get rid of the house, which he's only just bought. But could there be another option? Last week saw David unexpectedly bump into old cellmate Andy whilst at the police station, who asked to borrow David's phone so he could give him his number. David did so, reluctantly, but finds himself calling up Andy and asking to meet. David knows Andy is dodgy, available to hire to anyone really, so he goes to him to ask if he has any work lined up that he could be involved in to come up with the money quick. Jack reveals he thinks if he can get involved in some petty crimes he can potentially get out of trouble, but this isn't going to end well. He's now in with Andy, who's in with Harvey, doing jobs on the sly, hopefully unbeknown to Harvey to pay off Harvey. Will David's plan backfire? 3. Cassie moves in with Ken. Over at number 1, Cassie is skating on thin ice by continuing to dope Ken's tea with antihistamines, despite her coming under increasing suspicion from Ken's family. Young Birdie had caught Cassie slipping something into Ken's drink a couple of weeks ago, but Cassie had claimed it was simply sweeteners. Cassie has been ensuring that Ken remains under regular doses in an attempt to secure her continued employment as his carer. After she slips him some more antihistamines next week, Adam and Alia can't help but note that Ken is looking a little peaky when they call over. When Ken later opens his credit card statement, he's confused to see some transactions he doesn't recognize. Last week saw Cassie slip Ken's credit card out of his wallet, before quietly replacing it later on that day. When Tracy scrutinizes the statement, she finds that the purchase was for an expensive hair product, and immediately points the finger at Cassie. Cassie manages to work her charm on Ken, who is convinced of her innocence. So much so that he has a proposition for her, asking if she would consider moving into number 1 on a permanent basis. Delighted, Cassie gratefully accepts. Steve and Amy are horrified when they learn that they'll soon have a new housemate. And when Cassie later explains to Evelyn that she's moving 4 doors down, Evelyn also can't help being a little suspicious. 4. Leanne is publicly humiliated. Elsewhere, after being ordered to partake in community service following her fraud charge, Leanne finds herself humiliated as she's tasked with litter picking next week. As is usually the case in Soapland, Leanne has been assigned to clean up the very area that she lives in, which suddenly appears to have an abundance of litter. Leanne is very self-conscious as she dons her high-vis jacket to start cleaning up around Rosamond Street, as she deals with a group of uncouth youths heckling her. Annoyed once her session is over, Leanne storms back over to the bistro and orders Toya to pour her some champagne. When Nick later comes in with Sam, there'll no doubt be further disapproving looks as Leanne kicks back. 5. Leanne and Steve rekindle their old passion. Later in the week, Steve can't help but notice that Leanne's looking down in the dumps as she sits with a cup of tea in the cafe. Feeling as though she needs a boost, Steve invites her over to number 1 for a drink. With Steve still unhappy about Cassie moving in with them, Amy later warns him to not kick up too much of a fuss, given that he is also only living there through Ken's kindness. As Amy heads out to a friend's party, Steve entertains Leanne as they open a bottle of wine together. The two reminisce over old times. Before Leanne explains her problems with Sam distancing himself from her, Steve tries to assure Leanne that she will always be an important part of Sam's life. And as one thing leads to another, Leanne leans into Steve and kisses him. Passion takes over as Steve kisses Leanne back. 6. Amy faces a ghost from the past. Whilst Steve is otherwise occupied with Leanne, he fails to see that his phone is continually going off as Amy desperately tries to contact him. Having arrived at the location of her friend's party, Amy was shocked to come face to face with Eric Sanford, the father of Aaron. Aaron left the street under a cloud in June 2023. After a night of heavy drinking together saw him rape an unconscious Amy. The case was dropped due to a lack of evidence, with Eric then planning to sue Amy for libel before Aaron's guilt caused him to drop the case and leave Weatherfield. Amy looks like she's seen a ghost as she finds herself surrounded by Eric and a whole group of men who are sporting a picture of her attacker on their t-shirts. But will Steve ever pick up her messages as she attempts to make a quick getaway? 7. Abby makes a huge mistake. Over at No. 13, Abby is doing her best to put on a brave face in the wake of husband Kevin's possible testicular cancer diagnosis. On top of the PTSD she is quietly suffering with from Mason's death. Abby has been continuously having flashbacks to both Mason and her own late son Seb, but has so far refused any offer of help from those who have noticed she's out of sorts. Next week Abby confides in Seb's former partner Nina that the attack on Mason has reignited all her grief from Seb's death 4 years ago, and how she's now got Kevin's health to worry about too. As Abby sees another vision of Seb in the window that evening, Abby claims that she's tired and heads up to bed, leaving Kevin even more concerned about his wife. Later in the week, Abby has young Alfie in the car with her as she makes her way to meet Kevin at the hospital for his ultrasound. But whilst at the precinct, Abby looks over to the spot where Mason was attacked and begins to have another panic attack. Climbing out of the car, Abby walks towards the playground transfixed to the spot where she tried to help Mason, but now sees herself cradling Seb's body in his place. Overwhelmed, Abby flees from the precinct, leaving her car behind. With Abby having not shown up at the hospital, Kevin is surprised to instead find Sister Debbie waiting for him outside the imaging department. As he returns home, he finds Abby curled up on the sofa and informs her that he will be getting his results within the next couple of weeks. Seeing that Abby is in a fragile mood, Kevin offers to go and pick an absent Alfie up from the childminder. Abby's face fills with horror as a sudden realization dawns on her. Later on, Debbie shares her concerns about Abby with Ronnie, and wonders whether her current mental state means that Alfie could be in danger. Abby is soon shocked to find Kevin seated at the kitchen table having a chat with a social worker, certain that it is down to Debbie's interference. 8. Chesney is summoned to the police station. Also next week, the Winter Browns are dealt a further blow just as it looked as though things were beginning to look up. Having recently received a payout following stepfather Les's death, Chesney has finally been able to pay off all of the family's outstanding bills, which brings relief to wife Gemma. As an added bonus, there's enough left over for the family to enjoy a proper holiday together, with Chesney revealing to an excited Gemma that he's booked a week in Alicante. There's further reason for celebration when Bernie and Dev summon their families to the Rovers to reveal their recent engagement. Everyone is delighted as Chesney toasts the happy couple. But Gemma and Chesney are soon brought back down to earth with a bump. When the police later call over at number 5 wishing to talk with Chesney. As Chesney heads off to the police station for a formal interview the following day. Gemma is worried sick. What do the police want?
Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more movie spoilers next week. Goodbye and see you again.